Plants and animals have been highly influenced by something called coevolution. This is when organisms influence each other's evolutionary pathways, or we can think of it as traits evolving in ways that match each other. And again, plants and animals have co-evolved particularly complex relationships related to pollination and seed dispersal. So we'll explore a couple more examples of this. We already saw some examples earlier. So with pollination coevolution, the benefit for the plants is that the better they're pollinated, the more genetic variation they have. So the more they can get their pollen spread around, the more likely they are to get interesting combinations of traits that can be selected for. And so, again, because plants can't move, they have to rely on animals to get that pollen movement. And so they have evolved traits to attract pollinators. An interesting feature of the relationship between pollinators and plants is that pollinators oftentimes have a constancy or fidelity, that means faithful, relationship to certain flowers. So they learn flower traits, and then they will actually return to that same type of flower and over again. For example, bees within a single day will oftentimes focus on just like, for example, roses. So for that day, they're only going to pollinate roses. And this makes pollen transfer much more precise and effective because the bee that day is always going from rose to rose to rose to rose, rather than if a bee was always going from like a rose to a lilac to a lavender flower. This would be not as great for the plant because rose pollen can't pollinate a lilac and lilac pollen can't pollinate a lavender. So fidelity helps you get better transfer of pollen. Flowers will differ in their colors, their smells, their shapes, their sizes in order to attract specific pollinators because, again, this improves the chances of getting this more faithful transfer of pollen rather than this random transfer of pollen. As a result of coevolution, we can have something called pollination syndrome. And I want to say explicitly, this word has a lot of connotations for us. Like in humans, we tend to think of this as a disease. So we think of, for example, Down syndrome or autism syndrome. But that's not the case here. So it's not a disease state. It's just a normal outcome of coevolution. So again, I just want to say this is not a disease state. It's a normal process that results from coevolution. And it happens when flowers become super specialized for particular pollinators. We can say that they are specialized rather than generalists. A generalist flower might have multiple pollinators that can come to it, but a specialized flower is going to only really attract a small subset. And some examples of how this occurs is to think about like birds, and birds are going to be the primary pollinators of an odorless red flower because they don't have a smell, and that doesn't matter for birds, and birds can see red. So birds don't have a sense of smell and they can see red. So these traits are going to align well with birds. Bees, on the other hand, don't see the color red and are more attracted to odors. So you'll see pollination syndrome between bees and blue, purple, yellow, or white flowers that have a sweet odor. The times when pollination syndrome can become a problem is really in the context of extinction. So again, remember, under normal circumstances, this is just a normal process that doesn't have any problems. But if one partner is endangered or on the verge of extinction, then the other partner can be in trouble, right? So if you have a decrease in the size of the pollinator population, then when you have a pollination syndrome, the outcome is that you're also going to have a problem in your plant population. So that's the risk of a pollination syndrome, but again, it's a totally normal process as long as everybody's doing well. This has been a big issue with honeybees, and so you hear a lot in the news about honeybees and how honeybee populations are declining. And this is actually more of an issue for our domesticated plants, because our domesticated plants, especially our fruit crops, are particularly dependent on the non-native honeybees. So honeybees were imported to the United States rather than being a native pollinator, but we use the honeybees to pollinate our fruit crops. And so as we have problems with our honeybee population, so if we have declining honeybee populations, then we can expect a decline in pollination of our fruit crops and therefore a decline in fruit. And again, this has major impacts for humans because that's our food source. And so that's why you hear a lot of concern in the news about the honeybee population. So here's some examples, a little more detail on these examples of pollination syndromes. So bees have color vision. You may have heard that they can actually also see UV, but they can't see red. They like smells, so they have a good sense of smell, and they are attracted to both nectar and pollen. So they eat nectar and they feed pollen to their young. So they're going to have be looking for flowers that smell good, that are all of these colors except red, right? So they're not going to be attracted to red and pink flowers. And they're going to have relationships with flowers that have both nectar and pollen. They want both of those things. Butterflies also have good color vision. They can see red, so you'll see them on red flowers too. They have a sense of smell. It's a little bit different. They actually smell it with their feet, so they'll land on a flower and then they're sensing the smell. And they're attracted to light floral scents. One of the big impacts that you see on flowers that rely on butterflies is that they tend to be broad and flat. So they're not shaped like this, right? Instead, they need to be shaped kind of like this. And that's because the butterfly, there's my butterfly, isn't it beautiful, has to be able to land on it. And it can't land on a flower shaped like this. So if you're familiar with flowers at all, one that butterflies really love is a zinnia. It has this shape to it. And then they feed with something called a proboscis, which is this long tongue that comes out of their mouth, and that little tongue fits down into little tubes. And so they're going to like flowers that have little tubes on it. So the zinnia that I mentioned before actually has little nectar tubes along here that you can see a butterfly stick its proboscis down into. A pollinator that many people are not familiar with is moths. Moths are active at night, and so they are attracted to flowers that open at night. So anything that's called night blooming is oftentimes pollinated by moths. So like night blooming jasmine, for example, or a plant that's more common in Colorado is evening primrose. And that references that the opening of the flowers in the evening or nighttime. That night activity is also why they favor white flowers or very bright flowers. So evening primrose, for example, is oftentimes kind of a bright yellow color, and that will help the moths see it in the nighttime. They have a good sense of smell as well, but they prefer kind of more musky odors than floral odors. So smells that we don't necessarily find as attractive, they do like those. They also feed with a long, thin tongue. They're related to butterflies, and so they also go for floral tubes. Birds oftentimes are primary pollinators of red flowers. They have color vision and they see red really well. They do require a perch usually, the only exception being hummingbirds. So that requires like a thick stem with a flower on it, right? So they can't land on like a tulip. They would just flop over a tulip. They need that sturdy perch to be on the flower. They don't have a good sense of smell, so if a flower doesn't have a scent, that oftentimes means it's pollinated by a bird. They're daytime active, so they need flowers that are open in the daytime. They're really energy intensive. So birds that feed off of nectar need a lot of nectar. And so they're really attracted to flowers that have high nectar. So this would be things like a hibiscus, honeysuckle. These things are optimized to have a lot of nectar down in them. And then hummingbirds, I mentioned, they don't need a perch, but they do need to be able to hover underneath. So for hummingbird pollinated things, you'll oftentimes see a flower that kind of hangs down. And then the hummingbird, there's my beautiful, oops, that's really bad. There's my hummingbird. It has to be able to flutter in place while sticking its nose down in there. So you see dangling flowers be very commonly pollinated by hummingbirds. Another unusual one is bats. Bats are actually a big pollinator too. They cannot see color, but they can see reflection. So white, again, like white is a good color for bat pollination. They can smell and they like strong odors. Again, ones we might not find as appealing, but they do. They're night active usually, so again, open at night. Like birds, they're bigger and need more food, so they're also attracted to high nectar. You may have heard that bats echolocate, and that's, again, because they're moving around at night, they can't rely on vision. And so they're also able to identify hanging flowers more easily. And so you see bats commonly pollinating those. So we can see some examples. This is actually the zinnia that I mentioned. And you can see it's flat and it has these tubes that it sends its proboscis down into. Here's a hibiscus flower. There's a lot of nectar down in that tube. And the way that it's on the plant, the hummingbird can actually stick its head down in there. And notice when it does that, it's going to get the pollen of the flower all over its neck. And then the next hibiscus flower it goes to will get the pollen from it. And then here's a bat inside of a saguaro cactus flower, white and reflective. It has to be big and broad to fit that bat's head. And again, when the bat sticks its head down in there, it's going to get pollen all over here. Animals have also co-evolved with plants for seed dispersal. So we see fruit traits. So this particularly affects fruit traits in the plant, whereas pollination affects the flower traits. And it's tied to the same thing. Plants can't move, so they need some way to get their seeds away from the maternal plant, right? This is to avoid competition with the maternal plant. So we want the baby plants to avoid that competition with not just the maternal plant, but also each other, I should add. And something like a bird is a great way to get your seeds moving around. So this fruit here is red. So remember we said birds can see red, so that attracts the bird. And then another important part of it is that it's sweet and juicy, so the bird feels it's desirable and nutritious to eat. And the second piece of it is that the seeds that get eaten need to be able to survive the gut, right? So the fruit needs to have and the fruits and the seeds need to have all of those abilities in order to successfully work with a animal seed dispersant or just seed dispersal agent. Birds are a big example, but other things do this too. You know, bears are known for eating lots of fruit. Lots of other mammals, skunks, raccoons, right? Lots of other animals besides birds eat the fruit and spread it around. And one thing that we can think about is what happens to fruit as it ripens. So was this berry always red? No, right? A lot of times fruit is green, and then it goes to being red, pink, blue. It goes to some kind of different color other than green. And also as it ripens, it goes from hard to soft. Also as it ripens, it goes from sour to sweeter, right? And so all of these transformations are helping to attract the animal when the seed is ready, right? So this is not tasty. Whoops, sorry about that. So at this stage, this is not tasty, right? And it's hard to see, right? And so you don't see animals eating it at that time. And this is good because the seeds aren't ready. So the plant is intentionally making this transition. It's making its fruit undesirable when the seeds aren't ready. They appear ripe, the fruit is ripe, it has the bright colors, it's sweeter, it's softer when the seeds have matured. So this is optimizing seed dispersal for the plant. Coevolution has also happened between humans and plants as well. So in a more artificial way, but it's still coevolution. So remember we talked about artificial selection way back in chapter 23. This is the process by which humans have taken a wild plant. In the case of plants, this also is true with animals. They take a wild plant or animal and they turn it into a domesticated version. This started to happen about 10,000 years ago. And it's kind of fascinating because it actually happened around the globe in 10 different locations with different crops. So it was wheat in the Middle East and in the Americas, and specifically Mexico, we had corn being domesticated. And the other thing that's interesting about it is when you look at the grain crops like corn and wheat, these different people spread throughout the globe were selecting for really similar traits. So you see selection for bigger seeds, for example. And so bigger is almost always selected for, but then with grains in particular, you see selection for reduced shattering. So in wild grain, if you have a kernel of the wild type, so this is teosint, this is the wild form of corn. Actually kind of cool, there's like one place in Mexico where this still grows wild, and it's actually a national park in Mexico to protect it. And so the wild plant, when it's mature, will shatter. So all the held together seeds will break apart into loose seeds. And this is really good for the plant in the wild because this is scattering its seeds, right? So shatter equals scatter equals spreading your babies out, right? Again, reducing that competition by moving those babies further away. But if you're a human that wants to eat these little kernels, this is a terrible trait because when the grain shatters, the only way for you to go and get those grains is that you have to pick them up from the ground. So that's a huge time-consuming, difficult process to do. And your only other option is to harvest it when it's not ripe, when it hasn't shattered. But again, that's not optimal for nutrition and taste, right? So what humans gradually did over time was they selected for corn that didn't shatter as well. So in the wild, not shattering is a bad trait, but for humans, it's a good trait because it holds the kernels onto the cob, and the human can later take the kernels off whenever they're ready to. So today's corn has a very low shattering. It actually it takes a long time for corn kernels to come off. If you've ever had like decorative corn, you may know this, right? You can have that same decorative corn for years and the kernels won't come off unless you pick them off. And again, humans loved this trait because now they could harvest this in the fall, and then during the winter they could pick off the kernels, but all they had to harvest was this whole thing. They didn't have to pick these little pieces off the ground. And that's just one of many, many, many traits that humans have selected for in plants. So we'll end this plant chapter with a couple of just random review questions here. So the ripened swollen ovary of an angiosperm forms the, let you read those choices, and then I'll go through them. So the seed, no, the seed is going to form from the ovule. The ripened swollen ovary forms the carpel. No, instead the carpel is actually contains the ovary. But that's actually part of the flower. The stamen, also part of the flower. Okay, and this is actually that male part, so probably not related to the ovary. Fruit, yes, I'm going to go and circle this. So this is actually the true choice, but let's go ahead and eliminate pollen as well. Pollen is formed from the male gametophyte inside of the anther. So connecting it to a flower structure, it's forming in the anther. So the correct answer here is fruit. A small yellow flower with abundant pollen and nectar that is fragrant and open during the day is most likely pollinated by, okay, so let's circle the important things. Pollen, nectar, it's a small flower and it's yellow. It's fragrant and it's open during the day. So daytime, I'm going to eliminate moths and bats just for that reason. Okay. Pollen, nectar, and fragrant, I'm going to eliminate flies from that. Okay. Flies, I didn't mention these earlier, but they are occasionally pollinators. And they are typically pollinating things that are stinky. So they don't go for nectar. Like that isn't something that they eat. They generally go for rotting stuff. So that's why they're attracted to a stinky smell. You do have some flowers that mimic a rotting smell in order to attract the flies, but the flies don't actually eat pollen and nectar. So that's why that wouldn't make sense with this one. Birds, let's go up to birds here. Small is really my main elimination here for birds. They typically need big, just because they're bigger than a bug, they need to have a bigger flower. And so that leaves us with bees, and let's just make sure that makes sense. Small, yep, bees can see yellow. Bees like pollen and nectar. They like a sweet smell, and they're active during the day. So bees make sense here. Some flowers are not brightly colored at all, but have a very pungent odor that smells like rotting meat. How do we think these flowers are pollinated? Okay, so a pungent smell that smells like meat. Okay, birds are not meat eaters, for the most part. We do have carnivore birds. I should be careful. But those are ones that eat animals. Bees, they like sweet smells. So flies, moths, and bats, we said they oftentimes like more pungent, stinky odors. And so to distinguish these, we're relying on this. Not brightly colored at all probably suggests that it's not bats or moths, because remember, these ones are a lot of times relying on vision during the nighttime, and so relying on reflective or bright colors. And as I mentioned before, while moths and bats may like some pungent odors, they're not attracted to rotting meat the way that flies are. So flies would be this. And again, this is a less common example of a pollination of a pollinator, but also important for some types of plants. Okay, last review questions here. If the petals of a flower are reduced or absent, how is the plant pollinated? And what kind of angiosperms have reduced or absent petals? So this is just a recall here. I mentioned to you that if you don't have flowers, you're not attracting a pollinator. So we can say with certainty that they are not relying on an animal partner. And so if they're not relying on an animal pollinator, that highly suggests that they must be relying on wind, just like many of our gymnosperms do. And so the classic example of wind-pollinated angiosperms are our grasses. And so you probably have never thought of a grass having a flower. Most people don't really think of what they see on a grass's flower, but actually they do send up little stalks with kind of that fuzzy looking stuff. And this includes, by the way, the wheat and the corn. So our grain crops are all grasses. Our major grain crops are all grasses, and they're wind pollinated. This is important to realize when we think back on pollination syndromes. One of the challenges for honeybees is in places like the Midwest where you have a shift towards grain crops only, what is sometimes called monoculture, single crop. When that is all wind pollinated, it might as well be a desert or asphalt for honeybees or pollinators in general. And so you actually see that many of these, what people would think of as like the country, which would be good for pollinators, actually because it's all grain crops, it's actually worse than the city because these wind pollinated plants have nothing to offer an animal pollinator like a honeybee. Okay, let's take a look at this last one. In many flowers, the pistils and stamens reach maturity at different times. Considering what you know about pollination, why would this be an advantage to plants? Okay, so this is reviewing the life cycle. So pistils, remember that's the female part, and the stamens, that's the male part, right? This is saying they reach maturity at different times. So really what we're saying is the egg and the pollen mature at different times. So why would this be an advantage to the plant? Well, as long as these are maturing at different times, you are preventing self-fertilization, or at least reducing it. Why is it good to reduce self-fertilization, or why would plants like to reduce self-fertilization? This all goes back to genetic variation. So we get greater genetic variation if we limit self-fertilization, which increases our chances of a beneficial trait. That can occur by chance, right? Because every time we mix our genetics, we might get a beneficial trait, and then if we get a beneficial trait, that might be able to be selected for by natural selection.